So I'm walking here in the Pinckney State Recreation Area, and all around me you can see there's a pretty endless maze of trees and shrubs and other plants in the forest. And this is really exemplary of what you might see in a lot of places in Michigan today. But it didn't always look like this. Michigan's forested areas are an integral part of the state's identity. Half of its area is covered by woodland, adding up to the largest state forest system in the United States. Behind this apparent example of environmental conservation, however, hides a long history of logging, overexploitation, and environmental catastrophes. Here, in Michigan, the story of the forest recovery is that of the people who remembered what once was and decided to make a difference, one tree at a time. The story of Michigan's forests starts over 10,000 years ago, during the last ice age. At the time, much of the northern United States were completely covered in ice, and glaciers covered the entirety of Michigan's territory. Not much room for forests there. As they slid along valley floors, these gigantic ice sheets carved out a landscape that is unmistakably glacial. To this day, you don't have to look very far to spot traces of their passage, from moraines and enormous boulders to cames and eskers. The retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet carved out the Great Lakes some 12,000 years ago, literally giving shape to Michigan as we know it today. The smaller lakes that dot Michigan's landscape and are a source of life in its forests have a glacial past of their own as well, including kettle lakes like these. And so many of the lakes over time will actually transition into bogs, and that happens, as you can see here, when a bunch of plants start to grow on the sides. Over long periods of time, the plants will grow towards the center of the lake and deposit biomass, and eventually, in thousands of years, this whole lake will be gone and there will just be a wetland. As the climate warmed, the glaciers retreated. By around 10,000 BC, Michigan was ice-free, setting the stage for forests to take over. The first species that colonized this harsh landscape were cold-adapted pioneers, specialized plants able to withstand the harsh climatic conditions while taking root in the sediments left behind by glaciers. Over the following millennia, and as the tree line progressed northward, climatic fluctuations helped create a diverse mosaic of grasslands, hardwood forests, and pine groves. Humans began to settle in Michigan for the first time. Early indigenous communities consisted of Algonquin-speaking peoples belonging to 5 main tribes, though later on Michigan also became home to other groups of Native Americans. These indigenous communities subsisted in this landscape for thousands of years, hunting large game and fishing in Michigan's waters. When European explorers first set foot in this landscape, they came back with stories of the vast and continuous forests that met them there. Many early settlers traveled to America for the fur trade, but major settlements only took hold in the late 1700s. As recently as the 19th century, Michigan's forests were largely intact and old growth, even in the lower peninsula. Tocqueville, writing in 1831 about his journey from Detroit to Saginaw, wrote, "In this ocean of foliage, who can point the way? Where should one direct one's eyes? In vain you climb the tallest trees, only to find yourself surrounded by others still taller. To no avail you climb the hills, for the forest climbs with you everywhere. And this same forest stretches from where you stand all the way up to the North Pole in the Pacific Ocean." Unfortunately, the ancient ocean of foliage Tocqueville described would not last much longer. The state of Michigan, as we know it today, was established in 1837, after becoming an official territory a few decades prior. Early surveys from the U.S. government hinted at immense forests of white pine in the north, a species prized for its versatile wood and straight trunks. These reports estimated a standing stock at 150 billion board feet of pine. This wealth of resources soon attracted speculators who hoped to take advantage of the nation's early need for construction materials. In fact, much of the region's early population growth was driven by the burgeoning timber and mining industries. Starting in the 1840s, Michigan became the epicenter of the first American mining boom, and timber demand skyrocketed. A sustained supply of timber was essential to support the industry, enabling the construction of mine shafts and mining cities while providing essential fuel for smelting. By 1897, 160 billion board feet of pine had been cut, with only an estimated 6 billion remaining. In the barren northern landscape, attempts to convert cut-over land to agricultural purposes required residual slash to be burned, which led to frequent calamities. Sometimes, spillovers would turn into immense wildfires, with disastrous consequences for people, wildlife, and surviving vegetation. The full extent of the consequences are unclear to this day, but experts estimate that for every 2 trees harvested for timber, 1 more was accidentally burned. And to make matters worse, deforestation was only part of the story. After trees were brought back to civilization, immense processing plants discharged significant amounts of sawdust into nearby streams and rivers. The added nutrients caused harmful chemical and biological changes to the environment, leading to immense declines in fish populations. In parallel, overfishing and unsustainable hunting practices led to the extirpation of many emblematic species, including bison, caribou, and cougar. By the 1920s, an estimated 92% of Michigan's forests had been lost. At this point, early conservation and naturalist groups had for decades realized the toll that mining, logging, and pollution had taken on the state. Land conversion projects from slash clearings to fields largely failed, and the lands entered a cycle of private and state ownership as the state seized lands when taxes went unpaid and sold them again to farmers. This cycle led to poor resource use management and the overexploitation of natural resources, so eventually the state decided to change its land use strategy and consolidate its lands. This and community-driven efforts eventually led to the establishment of Michigan's first protected public lands. A series of legislative changes starting putting an emphasis on forest protection and conservation, including the Forest Commission Act in 1899 and the Forest Reserve Act of 1903. Just a few years later, in 1909, the Huron and Hiawatha National Forests were established, following the Ottawa National Forest in 1931. A network of fire towers was constructed between the 1910s and 1940s for the early detection of potentially devastating forest fires. During the Great Depression, many lands that had been damaged by overexploitation were restored and converted to national forests by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Established during the Great Depression, the CCC enlisted young men who agreed to work on conservation and rewilding projects. Between 1933 and the start of the Second World War, the CCC replanted around 485 million trees, with other programs focused on wildlife restoration. These federally owned lands would eventually transition back into state ownership, resulting in some of the natural areas most familiar to us in the Ann Arbor area, like the nearby Waterloo State Recreation Area. In the latter half of the 20th century, hundreds of smaller private and community-operated nature reserves were also created, resulting in the return of even more of Michigan's forests. Today, Michigan's forests serve as a reminder that passionate conservation and community-driven efforts can bring nature back from the brink. However, the story of Michigan's forests is far from over. The natural areas that generations of Michiganders have worked so hard to restore are increasingly under threat from increased habitat fragmentation, climate change, and invasive species. In order for these special and important pieces of nature to survive, it's important that we heed the warnings of the past and work to conserve the miraculously vast areas of nature that Michigan has rebuilt.